Brenda had never seen her parents and always wanted to know what kind of people they were. Life at the orphanage was not sweet. The children constantly quarrelled with each other, often resented each other, and some deliberately did bad things to others. Despite this, Brenda always remained a hard-working and obedient girl. There was no cruelty in her. At the age of 13, she had a real friend and protector. Louis was older than her for a few months, but he always defended Brenda, did not let her hurt, and all the children believed that they would marry when they grew up. When Brenda and Louis came of age and left the orphanage, they bought a house in the country near a small town. It was Louis's long-term dream to live in nature, in peace and quiet. The house required repair and was tiny, but Brenda was not upset by this. She did not care where to live, as long as her beloved was near and happy. The first time in the new place, everything was just fine. Louis took care of the yard, planted a garden, began some repairs in the house. Brenda felt the happiest and most loved person in the world because Louis was caring and affectionate, made modest gifts and praised her unskilled cooking. But after the wedding, the daily worries and accumulated irritation at work began to translate into small quarrels and estrangement. By this time, Brenda had already obtained a profession as a seamstress and got a job at a sewing factory, and Louis was working at a small production faculty in the neighbouring town. 6 months after the wedding, something strange began to happen to Louis. He began to complain of fatigue, stopped paying attention to Brenda, who waited impatiently for him from work. He became indifferent and somehow detached, and soon Brenda's fears were justified. She could smell another woman's perfume from her husband. "And how do you explain that?" she asked sternly, throwing her shirt into the washing machine. "We have many women in the factory. Many of them smoke. The boss scolds them that they're like ashtrays, so they pour literal bottles of toilet water on themselves." Seeing that he did not convince his wife of his excuses, Louis went over to her, embraced her and softly whispered, "My darling, except you, I do not need anyone." For a while Brenda calmed down, but doubts remained in her soul, and when she saw the lipstick on Louis's shirt, then she finally understood why her husband had become indifferent to her. Brenda pondered the situation for a few days, not knowing what to do, but everything was decided by Louis. 2 days later he came home absolutely drunk. He fell on his bed in dirty boots and began to shout, "I'm leaving you. Enough of this family drama. I love Megan. She understands me. She's not as boring as you." Brenda, unable to believe her ears, froze on the threshold of the bedroom. She was in shock, and her tears came pouring down. After a minute, she realized that Louis was asleep. She was so angry that she rushed to him and began to beat him on the back. "Get up, you rascal! How can you sleep? You've ruined our family. You ruined my life. Get up, I tell you!" Brenda shook her husband and urged him to wake up, but he did not move until morning and only snored loudly. Brenda cried all night in the chair. She could not accept that everything was over and fell asleep in the morning, when she felt completely exhausted and her strength ran out. In the morning, Louis got up frowning and with a sore head. He silently gathered his things and left, slamming the door loudly. "Well, get out of here," Brenda shouted, either to herself or to him. She spent the whole weekend in an almost daze. She hardly ate or slept, thinking and remembering. The weather outside was gloomy. The late fall had brought wet snow to the village, and a howling wind was breaking dry branches on the trees and carrying them away. But a sudden knock on Brenda's door interrupted her heavy musings. The woman frightenedly opened the door. On the threshold stood an elderly man in a light out-of-weather jacket, with stubby boots on his feet and a cap on his head, which could not warm his head in this weather. "I apologize for the late visit," he said. "I am in a very awkward situation. You see, I went by train to the city to visit my son, but I dozed off, and when I woke up, I didn't really know where I was traveling. So I thought it was the right station, but it wasn't. There will be no more trains today, and the street is dark and cold. I just wish I could spend the night and get warm." The elderly man resembled a homeless man. Brenda didn't know if she should believe him, but she felt pity for the stranger nonetheless. She allowed him in, and while she was putting the kettle on to make tea, he introduced himself as Mr. Adams. The man also explained that he had been in the hospital and ran away from there because he was tired of being there. The treatment didn't really help, so he decided to visit his son. Brenda gave Mr. Adams her husband's dry clothes and sat him down in front of the fireplace to warm himself. But she thought to herself that the man most likely had no son, and that he had simply invented all this. Nevertheless, Mr. Adams seemed like a decent man, and besides, the weather outside was a real thunderstorm. Almost the entire next week, Mr. Adams stayed at Brenda's. He often talked about his life, about his youth. Then, as if losing the thread of events, he switched to another subject, making long pauses. The villagers quickly found out that Brenda sheltered an old man, moreover, most likely homeless. The woman did not pay attention to what was being said around her. She was glad that she had lent a helping hand to the man in his hour of need. She didn't know what she would do next with him, but one thing was certain: she would never throw the elderly man out on the street. "I won't stay with you long. My son will find me soon and take me away, and he will thank you," often repeated the elderly man. And one day he shouted to the whole house, calling for Brenda. At that moment, the television was showing an interview with some entrepreneur. "Call him quickly. Tell him I'm here. He'll pick up." "You just tell him," demanded Mr. Adams, jumping up from his chair. "Are you sure it's your son? He doesn't look like you at all," Brenda answered doubtfully, raising one eyebrow. "You can rest assured he was a late child of ours. We couldn't have children. My wife was unwell. It's a pity she can't see our boy now, what he has achieved. Come on, call quickly. There's a telephone hotline showing." Brenda, on the other hand, thinking that the older man had mistaken, did not do anything. But she had no idea that Mr. Adams would pick up her phone and call himself. 2 days later, everything in Brenda's life went upside down. Early in the morning, the unfaithful husband showed up, looking at her with the eyes of a battered dog. "Forgive me, my love. I need only you. I realized that I stumbled, but that's no reason to forget everything good that was between us," wailed Louise, almost crying. Brenda barely contained the squeamishness, began to explain to her husband that it was all over between them. But suddenly he noticed Mr. Adams in his clothes. "Who is this? Who have you brought into the house? Have you set up a shelter for homeless people in our house?" "Don't you dare say that. You're 5 minutes homeless yourself, so go where you've been," Brenda burst out. No one knows how this quarrel would have ended, but at that moment a man in an expensive business suit got out of a black Mercedes that pulled up to the house and entered Brenda's house. "How did you get here, Mr. Adams? What are you doing here?" Louise looked in puzzlement at the director of the factory where he worked. "Hello. I came to pick up my father. He called me, gave me this address and said he was being cared for by a nice woman named Brenda." Spencer smiled at Brenda, and she realized with amazement that the elderly man had told the truth about who his son was. Meanwhile, father and son embraced fervently and Mr. Adams began to explain to his son that he could no longer be in that hospital, that he was sad and homesick to be alone. The son mildly reprimanded his father that he had to finish the course of treatment and undergo necessary examinations, but deep in his heart he was glad that his father had finally been found. Before he left, Spencer sincerely thanked Brenda for her kind heart and for sheltering and warming his father. After that, the son and the father often called and visited Brenda together, but her life took an entirely dark turn. She filed for divorce, and now, almost every day, was listening to scolding from her husband, who first asked for forgiveness and now threatened to sue her for all joint property. One day, Spencer offered to stay at their house for a while until she could work out the details of the divorce and the apartment. At first she refused, but Mr. Adams said he would resent her refusal, and Brenda reluctantly agreed. After some time, Spencer and Brenda became friends, and Brenda felt herself to be a part of a real family where relatives cherish each other. But she was not yet ready for a more close relationship with Spencer. So Spencer had to be patient to win her heart completely. It took 2 years for Brenda's heart wounds to fully heal. Spencer and Brenda's wedding was small, but Brenda felt truly loved and knew that Spencer's heart belonged only to her. Mr. Adams could not rejoice in the happiness of the young couple, realizing that it was thanks to him that Spencer and Brenda had met.